From the tragic death of Vladimir Komarov to reports of cosmonauts dying alone in space, their fates kept secret by the Soviet government, these are space missions that ended in unexplainable disappearances. Vladimir Komarov was the first human to die in space. In 1967, Komarov piloted Soyuz 1, a Soviet spacecraft that was basically a death trap from the start. Engineers knew that there were major issues, but they launched it anyway. The spacecraft malfunctioned in orbit, the parachutes failed on re-entry, and Komarov slammed into the Earth at full speed. The Soviets claim they recovered his remains, but some sources say that he was completely vaporized on impact, leaving nothing but a charred pile of metal. There are reports of intercepted radio transmissions where Komarov was cursing out Soviet officials, fully aware that he was doomed. His voice was picked up by US intelligence. If true, he spent his last moments screaming at the people who sent him to his death. I've heard recordings of this, and it is pretty eerie. Then there's the open casket funeral. Official photos show what looks like a lump of charred remains, barely human at all, but if he was completely incinerated, what exactly did they put in that coffin? Some suspect the Soviets staged the whole thing to save face. They needed a body, or at least the idea of one, to keep the illusion of control. The true fate of Komarov's remains, though, is still a bit of a mystery to this day. The Soviet Union was obsessed with winning the space race, but they weren't exactly known for transparency. Some believe Yuri Gagarin wasn't the first person in space, just the first one that they admitted to. According to some conspiracy theorists, the USSR sent up several cosmonauts before him, and when things went wrong, they simply erased them from history. The most compelling evidence comes from two Italian men, the Giudica Cordiglia brothers. These amateur radio operators claimed they'd intercepted all these Soviet transmissions from these doomed missions. One recording supposedly captures a woman's voice saying, I'm hot, I'm burning," as she dies on re-entry. Another has a man gasping for breath, struggling to describe his surroundings before going silent. And if these recordings are real, it would mean the Soviets launched people into space, watched them die, and then covered it up. The Soviets denied everything, of course, but there are photos of Soviet spacesuits that don't match any known missions. Official documents reference cosmonauts who never had public flights. Even Gagarin himself hinted that he wasn't the first, but he quickly stopped talking about it. Could he have known something he wasn't supposed to share? In 1989, the Soviet Union launched Phobos 2, a probe designed to study Mars and its moon, Phobos. Everything was going fine until the very last moment. Just before it was supposed to drop landers onto the Martian moon, it sent back one final transmission. The last image it captured, a massive, inexplicable shadow on the surface of the moon, and then silence. Phobos 2 was gone. NASA and the Soviets figured it was a malfunction, but the probe had functioned perfectly for months. It made it all the way to Mars, survived the harsh conditions, and then, right as it was about to complete its mission, it just stops working. The timing seemed a little suspicious, and that shadow, some say it looked like a massive cylindrical object hovering above the Martian surface. A natural formation, a camera glitch, or something else entirely. The Soviets never gave a satisfying answer, and Phobos 2 was never heard from again. Some speculate that it got too close to something that it shouldn't have, and whatever was out there didn't want it broadcasting. Apollo 11 is famous for landing the first humans on the moon, but there's a lesser-known part of the story that's more unsettling. According to some sources, during their time on the moon, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin had a private conversation with Mission Control, a conversation that wasn't meant to be heard by the public. The claim is that NASA had a 2-minute radio blackout, during which Armstrong described seeing something strange, massive structures and a strange other spacecraft watching them. Some versions of the story say these objects were lined up along the crater's edge, like they were observing the Apollo landing. Former NASA employees have hinted that classified footage does exist, footage that was never released to the public. Was Armstrong rattled by what he saw? He never spoke openly about it, but Aldrin later admitted to seeing a strange light following them in space. NASA dismissed it as a piece of debris, but Aldrin seemed less convinced. And then there's the issue of this lost footage. NASA infamously lost the original Apollo 11 videotapes, including the raw transmission from the moon. How does that even happen? Well, some believe that it was intentional, that the footage contained something that wasn't meant to be seen. Did Armstrong and Aldrin see something extraterrestrial? If they did, we'll probably never know the truth. Vladimir Ilyushin, born in 1927, was no stranger to danger. Growing up in an aviation family, it was almost expected that he'd become a test pilot. Well, in April of 1961, just days before Yuri Gagarin's historic flight, the Soviet Union announced that Ilyushin had been in a bad car accident. But here's where things start to get a little strange. Rumors began spreading that Ilyushin hadn't been in a car accident at all, but instead, he'd been involved in a botched space mission. Some outlets, including the Daily Worker, reported that he'd tried to make an orbital flight and that something had gone wrong. Then a French broadcaster claimed Ilyushin launched in March and slipped into a coma during the flight. But here's the thing, NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, didn't pick up any signals of a launch. But then things got even weirder. American news started spreading stories about how maybe Yuri Gagarin's famous flight was a cover-up, that Gagarin was just standing in for Ilyushin, who was too ill to go public. The theory has led to a whole conspiracy, even making its way into films like the Cosmonaut cover-up from 1999, where Ilyushin's mission supposedly ended with a crash landing in China after a guidance failure. But did he really take that fateful flight, or did he actually just die in a car crash? No one knows for sure. Mars Observer was supposed to be NASA's big comeback in planetary exploration. Launched in 1992, it was designed to study Mars' atmosphere, climate, and surface in detail, but just as it was about to enter orbit in 1993, all contact was lost. 1 second it was fine, and the next it was gone. The official theory is that a fuel system leak caused the spacecraft's propulsion system to rupture, effectively ending the mission before it could begin, but because they never recovered it, that's just a guess. Some think a software error, others think an undetected design flaw doomed the probe from the start. There are even conspiracy theories about how it was deliberately taken out. By who or what, no one knows. One odd detail is that Mars Observer had military-grade imaging equipment on board. NASA said it was just repurposed from spy satellites, but some believe it was meant to take high-resolution images of something specific. Whether that had anything to do with its disappearance, who knows? Soyuz 2 was supposedly an uncrewed mission. It was the target for the manned Soyuz 3 mission to dock with, just a routine part of Soviet spaceflight plans in October of 1968. At least that's the official story. And in 1993, an American journalist named Mike Arena claimed that there was more to it. According to him, there actually was a cosmonaut aboard Soyuz 2, a man named Ivan Ashtishnikov, along with his dog Kloka. And according to his story, they never came back. Arena claimed that during the mission, a meteorite struck the craft, wiping out Ashtishnikov and Kloka. The Soviets, in the middle of an intense space race with the US, supposedly covered the whole thing up. They erased all records of him, removed his name from Soviet archives, and made it seem like he just never existed. Well, it turns out this story isn't true. The whole thing turned out to be an elaborate hoax created by Spanish artist Johann Fontcuberta. He fabricated mission patches, he digitally altered photos, and even created fake Soviet documents as part of this art exhibit. It was so convincing, though, that it tricked not just regular people, but even some media outlets. In 1998, a magazine in Mexico published a full issue on Ashtishnikov, completely unaware that they were spreading a fictional story. Some people even still believe this, even after the artist admitted that it was all fake. The Soviet Zond program was a series of robotic spacecraft meant to explore the Moon and Mars. Zond 2, launched in 1964, was supposed to be one of the USSR's first successful Mars missions. It made it through interplanetary space just fine, even successfully testing out its ion thrusters, which were cutting-edge technology for the time. But then, halfway to Mars, it went dark. The Soviets lost contact and had no way of figuring out what happened. No distress signals, no malfunctions detected before it went silent, just complete radio silence. It's assumed that some kind of electrical failure cut off communications. There's no proof of that. Zond 2 kept drifting toward Mars, but since it couldn't be controlled, it missed its target and vanished into deep space. Had it worked, it would have been a huge win for the Soviets. Instead, it became one of many failed attempts to reach Mars. Zond 2's twin spacecraft, Zond 3, was launched later and worked just fine. Whatever happened to Zond 2 was specific to that one probe, and since no one ever recovered it, the exact cause is still unknown, and that's not the only lost Soviet probe sent out to Mars. The Soviet Union had a notoriously bad track record when it came to Mars missions. Throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s, they launched over a dozen spacecraft to the Red Planet, and almost all of them failed. Some exploded on launch, others malfunctioned en route, and a few made it to Mars only to mysteriously stop working right before they could complete their missions. One of the strangest cases was Mars 3 in 1971. It was the first spacecraft to make a soft landing on Mars and even managed to transmit a single blurry image, but after just 14.5 seconds, it cut out, and no one really knows why. The lander was designed to survive Martian conditions, and there was no obvious reason it should have failed so quickly. The Soviets never heard from it again. In December of 1959, a huge leak hit the news when a high-ranking Czechoslovakian communist revealed information about some top-secret Soviet space missions. According to him, a cosmonaut named Alexei Lavotsky was launched aboard a modified R-5A rocket, and that several other cosmonauts died during these covert flights. The story was picked up by the Italian news agency Continentale, but after that, nothing. The story just went dead. So the question is, was this just some wild rumor, or were the Soviets really hiding a darker side to their space program? With all that said, I've been your host James, and I'll catch you, yes you specifically, in the next video.